Recently I heard a quote on television that was not by somebody that's known for any Christian commitment, but what was said moved me. It was a quote from Steve Irwin, well known for his work with crocodiles and lots of other critters, and it was a quote given by his wife with her and his children, of course with him absent. Basically, if I can remember accurately, he said, "I don't care if people remember me, but I do want them to remember what I said." It's intriguing when you read Luke's introduction to his gospel, where he notes that there have been many opinions given by that time already about the nature of what Jesus said and did. And both he and John, in his first epistle, make comment about what was said and what was done and what was said. And I guess really at the end of the day, if we're disciples of Jesus, what ought to mark our lives is the extent to which that which we say and that which we do is at least close to the pattern and content of Jesus' life and sayings. I'm giving this particular tape urgently hoping that all chapters will give it serious attention, because although we expected that I was going to pass on quite a few years ago, I'm still here, and I really hope to continue to do preaching as I do from time to time, and teaching, and maybe to use electronic media like this to get the message out. I want to continue to do that. But this last period of hospitalisation has included, beyond the battle against cancer, which is still going, a couple of heart attacks. And they've made me a little more vulnerable at this time. So in one sense, I hope not, but this may be almost the last will and testament of the founder of God Squad in the form that it currently exists around the world, and therefore is a serious statement that I hope all members of God Squad will eventually listen to. Of course, obviously, I've never been a person to shy away from controversy, and quite obviously I'll end up saying some things that will cause discussion between people. But what I am concerned about is that the theology and direction of God Squad maintains an interesting phrase that we find in one of the epistles: the faith once delivered to the saints. Now, I'm well aware that in one sense God Squad is a speckled bird, as they say. For a couple of decades you couldn't become a member of God Squad unless you were attending one of our communities of faith and actually be in reception of a constant stream of the kind of theology that was foundational and a continuing nurturing of our movement. We came to a crisis point where eventually we decided that there were so many talented people I hope you're listening now, because there are far more of you now amongst us who weren't part of that early group than those who were. And you've served us so well, so wonderfully in following decades. But the one thing we did lose, while gaining a much richer and more diverse and inclusive community of broad faith, the one thing we did lose was a strong central theological core continuing in the particular traditions that brought us into being and that served us so well in those first 30 years, particularly of travelling all over Australia and all around the world in evangelism and teaching. So I want to today address the subject of our theology, how we can assure that we stay on the line of a biblical, Christocentric, Jesus-centred theology into the future. Now, I have no illusions about this. And denominations have risen and fallen, but even those that have lasted for many centuries, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox movement, the Methodists, not so much in this country, but in other countries like Great Britain and the US, the Lutherans, in more, I guess, a little bit after the beginning of the Reformation, the Anabaptists and the various Baptist traditions, and much later, groups like the Churches of Christ. But in some of the definitive discussions about theology and interpretation of what Jesus said, in recent days there's been quite a almost tearing up of tradition, or reshaping of tradition, depending what your particular view is. I've had quite a bit of communication from people who were part of our early movement, particularly senior ministers in the Uniting Church these days. It used to be in the Methodist Church in South Australia, including Ian Clarkson, who served for 5 years as a very wonderful pastor with his wife Rosemary. And some of the changes of thinking inside of their own denomination have caused so much heartache to them, as they feel those changes are departing from real submission to the biblical text and more submission to cultural shifts that really have little to do with a biblical worldview. Some of them have written to me in recent days or text me to speak of their distress at the loss of central core theological issues in their own denominations. And I'm quite aware that no group is guaranteed faithfulness to the end of its days. And in some cases, huge church denominations have walked well in the gospel and then gone down into the valley of death almost, and then recovered again and come back to their original faith once delivered. But all of this leads me to say that we need some very clear principles as to how we, as best we can, sustain the best of our traditions in biblical faithfulness and in faithfulness to Jesus. St. Paul once said, "You became followers of us and also of the Lord." And in our human frailty, in actual fact, none of us in isolation develop our own worldview or theology. There are many people that contribute to the way we see the world and the way we see or don't see God and the Christian tradition. And St. Paul made it very clear in following apostolic writing to young Timothy, who he'd appointed to be the pastor of the Ephesian church, that in fact it was the teaching that Timothy had received which had put him in good standing to give leadership in that growing first century church. So it is important for us to look back on that, not because that makes any of us that were significant to the period of Bible teaching in our movement somehow demigods or incontrovertibly right about everything. It doesn't mean that. But it does mean, if we follow through the writings of Peter and Paul, it does mean that we need to take seriously the sources from which we've received our theological views. Now, because these days people don't have the kind of ability to retain and listen for a long time to long speeches, such as they did a couple of centuries ago, when politicians would speak for 2 hours or 3 hours and people would sit and listen, spellbound. But I know that's not true today, and therefore I've got to somehow shorthand, as it were, some things that I wish I could spend a lot of time on. You can search out for yourself. Read the book of Jude, read the epistles of Peter, and read St. Paul's epistle, particularly his first and second epistle to Timothy. You'll find in those and other New Testament writings that there's a warning that in the last days there will be a collapse of adherence to good truth. Now, whether these are the last days or not, Christians all over the world are debating constantly. But certainly there is a very strong, continuous line of warning in the epistles, and in fact in the teaching of Jesus too, that somehow or other people will slide away from the truth they've received and listen to things that are more acceptable to their lifestyle or to the world view that surrounds them. That somehow or other in those last days there will be a great deal of theological confusion. You might say, what does that matter? Well, I grew up in the days when certainly what you believed was all important. Sometimes to the point almost of, might I say it, mental constipation. Sometimes to the point where people were treated cruelly and terribly because they departed from some minor interpretation of a biblical passage. In those days, orthodoxy, as they call it, right ideas, right truth, right theology, was all important. Now, I've lived through a period in which that came under enormous challenge. Now, many of you that are younger will have grown up with quite a different view, and you wouldn't have lived through those more staunch, more legalistic, this is the truth kind of contexts. But what was all important about orthodoxy shifted during the time of what we call liberation theology, which emerged mainly from oppressed people in Central America and some in Africa. It shifted to what we call orthopraxy. In other words, it isn't good enough to believe it right. You've got to live it right. And of course, as I said before, earlier on, it's very clear, you know, Luke makes it very clear, John makes it very clear, that it's all that Jesus both did and said in consistency that shapes a true Christian tradition. And one of the things that comes out of this for me is a concern about the way in which sometimes, even in our own movement, there's been a kind of sense that it doesn't matter so much now what you believe as long as we love one another. Well, truly, love is the greatest of all the gifts of God, no question about that. But it does matter what you believe. And if you doubt that, please sit down and read through the New Testament again. Jesus was not crucified because he was nice. He wasn't crucified because he was a good carpenter and good at his trade. He wasn't crucified because he was nice to little children. He was not crucified because he healed the sick. He was crucified because of the things he said, and sometimes the things that he did being done according to the legalists at the wrong time in the wrong place. But the sticking point for so many of our friends out there in the secular world is the sticking point of who Jesus was and of whether what he said was true. He said, not I am one of the ways you can take. He said, I am the way. He didn't say, there's a heap of different truths, take your pick, mate. He said, I am the truth. He didn't say, well, you can have a good life and ignore me, you can follow Buddha or anybody else. He said, I am the life. He was so exclusive that he said, no man comes to the Father except through me. Now, I admit people might find God because of the work of Jesus and not necessarily be fully aware of the significance of that. But nevertheless, he said, I am the good shepherd. He said, I am the gate through which the sheep enter into life. He said, I am the water of life. I am the resurrection and the life. His sayings were extraordinary. Unfortunately, in the day of multiculturalism, there's a tendency for many Christians to feel embarrassed about the exclusiveness of Jesus. Now, our movement has always been loved by outsiders because we're seen as an inclusive movement. That is, we've not closed our hearts or our evangelism or our ministry to anybody because of who they hang out with or where they go on a Saturday night or what their marriage status is. We've never ever allowed those things to stop us from loving. Nevertheless, while love may be unconditional, salvation is not. And forgiveness is not. I mean, it's pretty exclusive in the first epistle of John. It says, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. For those of you with a Catholic background, maybe sometimes you understand the business of confession better than some Protestants do. although we've got to be careful we don't just make it into a religious form rather than fully a matter of the heart. But I'm concerned as our world becomes more and more committed to undefined and unguided inclusivism, that we don't lose the fact that the gospel is embarrassingly exclusive. It excludes nobody from the point of view of God's love and open arms to every human being. But it does exclude on the basis of what we do with that offer. And it's one of the areas theologically where I think I sometimes see on Facebook and other places some weakening kind of worldviews that are not consistent with the gospel. It's some of these little, if you will, amber lights, not sort of raging red lights, stop, but amber lights that say caution, that cause me to want to do this particular presentation or series of presentations about theology. Let me come back to the beginnings of God Squad. On my jacket, I've had a little tag that says founder. Let me say that historically, I didn't ask for that. Secondly, I was a bit toey about putting it on there in the first place. And thirdly, it was the request of my chapter, the founding chapter of God Squad in Melbourne, that I eventually conceded the point and put it there. Now, it's been a point of contention for some of our friends from Sydney. And I want to clarify that. I don't want it any way to be nasty, to undermine the goodness of my brothers that originally were in the Sydney chapter. But I want to make some very strong statements, which I'm quite open to public or private debate, if need be. Statement number one: the theology that we developed for God Squad owed nothing to the Sydney chapter of God Squad. Number two, we inherited these wonderful colours from Sydney. Definitely, and I thank God for that. Number three, as a greenhorn, so to speak, as far as motorcycles were concerned, I thank God for the enormous patient encouragement and help and education on aspects of riding on the road and of mixing it with brothers and sisters from outlaw clubs that I received from the Sydney Club. Now, without that, and it's amazing how God synthesises things in your life and brings tributaries of influence in from all over the place that actually shape your life and ministry. And I thank God for that. But I want to say that the missional shape and the theological content of God Squad as it's been known since 1972 owes nothing to the Sydney chapter of God Squad. I didn't pick up any new insights. I was already deeply involved in the search for cross-cultural communication. That didn't come from Sydney. And the bike scene was added into a pool of many different subcultures that we were interested in from the very beginning. One being education, high school students, that we ended up having massive ministry to. Another was fringe political agitators, because it was during the period of the Vietnam War and the protest movements against the Vietnam War. The question of the gospel and war and peace was central to us before we ever met any of the guys in Sydney. The issue of the arts and of music as very central in the history of the growth of the Christian movement was also something thoroughly developed in our own ministry before we ever met the guys from Sydney. Now, I have sweet and rich memories of fellowship that enhanced my life and encouraged me in including God Squad as part of what was, for us, a Jesus movement that was dealing with hippies at that stage as much as it was dealing with bikers. So let me take one step further forward. At the very beginning of our ministry, in 1972, at the time of the formation of the Melbourne chapter, we had already begun to develop ministry apart from the bike scene. And I made a journey to the United States to investigate what was happening with all the hundreds of thousands of counterculture people who were coming to faith. And I went to visit many of those major movements while I was overseas. And while I was there, I went to a movement called Calvary Chapel. And there'd been a hippie who'd been a bisexual hippie who had been wonderfully converted. He was a strange character, sort of almost like a little prophet, came out with all sorts of prophetic stuff. And he actually was the person that caught the attention of a disaffected Pentecostal pastor who could see that God was doing something and who embraced him and his little communes, Christian communes, that were starting to develop. He was to later on not only be important in founding that particular movement, which now has, I understand, tens of thousands of churches, many of them with many thousands of members, but he also later on was the person that sparked off with John Wimber the beginning of what we know as the Vineyard Movement. So when I went over there, I went and watched one of their, I think it was a Monday night, I can't remember which night of the week, but their weekly Bible studies. By this time, Chuck Smith had become the Bible teacher. He was fairly conservative compared to where I was, but he was a grandfatherly type, caring, wonderful communicator. And in that circus tent, there must have been a gathering of something like, I don't know, 3,000 people. And I remember at the end of that Bible study, an appeal was made, and just scores, if not hundreds and hundreds, of long-haired, barefooted hippies, mostly, came out to seek the Lord, while a wonderful group called Love Song was singing a very moving song called Welcome Back. Welcome back to the truth you always knew was there, or something like that. You can look it up online. It's a marvellous song. Welcome Back by Love Song. While I was there, I don't want to be dramatic about it, but it was as if God spoke so definitely to my heart and said, go back to Melbourne and teach every Monday night. Start with the book of Acts, the story of the early church, and just teach the scriptures. Now, teaching scriptures, I'll go back to this at some other stage, but that was certainly a familiar thing for me. But the spirit in which we started, that was different, because there was a feeling like we were emerging as a 20th century new church, like a bunch of new young believers. And those Bible studies, which I didn't think would work, my reply to God was, Australian secular people are not going to sit down and listen to a Bible study. Forget it. And it was like God said, you don't worry about that, just do as you're told. And so we began those Bible studies. And before long they were packed out. And at their height, years later, I think they reached at one stage so many that they were packed right out from our little building out to the edge of the road, around 500 people. Now, those Bible studies were thoroughly and carefully prepared, even examining the meaning of the Greek words in the text, all of that stuff. And from 1972 to 1982, that was just constant. And that was the material that built the basic biblical worldview for God Squad. It did not come from Sydney. And that's why we talk about God Squad as being formed from 1972 on our jackets. And I don't want to undermine the wonderful love and care for their mates that my biker friends in Sydney chapter had expressed. And they began a simple and straightforward, very much Youth for Christ type theology, what I would call almost fundamentalistic theology, but they had a concern to reach their mates. And of course they were led by Paul, who was wonderfully suited to do that because he was a mechanic, so he was good at working with bikes, and that was a gift I never had. And so when we began with their support. We went road with them a little bit, just a little group of us, sometimes called the Secret Seven, which is a later make-up. But we rode with them in all sorts of situations in New South Wales. And I learnt, as it were, the trade of being on the road and being with biker mates. For that, I am so grateful. And I see it as a real gift of God that happened. But the theology and the mission statement of God Squad did not come from Sydney. Basically, it came from a long time ago in a different place. It really came from England. It came from a time when a rather uppity, somewhat self-righteous Anglican priest had an extraordinary conversion. He'd written in one of his memoirs, "I went to America to convert the Indians, but who, oh who, will convert me?" Now, I haven't time to go on with all this except to say that Wesley took the gospel not only all over England and Ireland and that part of the world, but he also took it to America, and Francis Asbury, a young man who he ordained for the task, spread the gospel, a Methodist type gospel, across America. Now, if you look up Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll find that it says that Wesley actually did more to promote good literature and reading in England in the 1700s than any other person in history. Now, that's pretty extraordinary. So he was someone that wanted people to learn and think. In fact, he said to one of his preachers one day, "If you will not read, you will not preach." And he said, any of his preachers who wanted to learn to read, he'd teach them. Not only that, he'd give them a free book to read, and if they read that one and proved it, he'd give them another one. He published so many books that he was financially in a position to do that I never was in. But Wesley had a bunch of preachers who were not academics. They were like most people within God Squad. They were tinkers and bootmakers and that kind of thing. In fact, so much so that one of the bishops got angry once and said, "Wesley, you disgrace the gospel by having these illiterate tinkers and bootmakers going out there and preaching the gospel." To which Wesley rather cheekily said, "My bishop, if my tinkers and bootmakers didn't know more of the Spirit of God and the Word of God than the average bishop, I wouldn't send them out." But that was part of what was the DNA of God Squad. An expectation that our minds should be alive and examining the truth. And right through the history of God Squad, we've always had a battle with that. If people have come into the squad who've had academic qualifications, they've often found it a little difficult to get their colours, to be honest, at some stages. There's been a little bit of a reverse snobbery sometimes in some chapters of God Squad over the years, although mostly that gets overcome. But we certainly always held the careful, intellectually vigorous examination of biblical text as central to our tradition. The second thing is, Wesley said, "The world is my parish." And the reason we have God Squad in many countries in Northern Europe and in New Zealand and America is not by accident. It didn't just happen. It's happened because over 3 or 4 decades, often helped by some tremendous mates that have travelled with me as members of God Squad. But nevertheless, I've spearheaded evangelism and Bible teaching all over the world, in dozens and dozens of countries, ranging from the edge of China through to the Ukraine and the European old countries like Holland and Germany and Finland and Sweden and so on. I'll come back to that later on because I think it is important. But just now, enough to say, the tradition of being on the road for Jesus, taking the gospel all over our nation, in every state and remote places in the far northwest and in the Northern Territory and down in Tasmania, that has been part of our DNA. And might I say, most of the chapters of God Squad in Australia, none of which were planted by the existing chapters, none of which were planted by the Sydney Squad, but all were planted as an outcome of the 1972 plant in Melbourne. Most of those chapters were attached to having evangelistic outreaches in localities. That's so with Brisbane. It's so with Launceston. It's so with Hobart. And a number of other centres where we would hold evangelistic outreaches that always involved going to the universities, going to the high schools, not just to the bikers. But each time we go and do something like that, there'd be some Christian bikers excited by what we did because it was a beautiful meshing together of of the black culture, but also these other cultures around the edge. And out of that, various chapters were formed all over this country, and eventually what's happened in Europe. Many don't realise how much work I put into particularly Holland, but also some of the Scandinavian countries. And of course, the first chapter in the Northern Hemisphere was because of several years of communicating with our brother Sean, who I believe from the beginning was an outstanding person to give leadership in God Squad. And it was many of those times together while attending the big festival at Greenbelt that the conversations eventually led to the formation of God Squad in the Northern Hemisphere, and from there it spread to other countries with various aspects of input. And I have in my heart, for those that might watch this in the Northern Hemisphere, I have a real heart for so many countries up there. The journey that Glenna and I took through Bulgaria and Romania and through the Ukraine, where we preached in one of the biggest churches in the Ukraine while we were there. Those journeys of taking food and essential items as the Soviet Union was collapsing, those were incredible memories for us. And that was long before God Squad was to be formed in the European setting. But it's important for us to know that. And I didn't want to talk about it, but because there's been so much tension about this, I felt I owed it to you as brothers and sisters to give my perspective on why it is I've had this little patch here that says founder. As far as the theology and mission policy of the World Being Our Parish as a preaching platform, that is something that never came from Sydney. And in fact, as I think many of you know, I have over 1,000 newspaper and magazine cuttings that describe the missions we've had all over this country, and also articles from France and Germany and Holland and England and Wales and Ireland that describe the mission we've done around this nation and around the world, which was not a mission being carried out by the Sydney Squad. Although, bless the Lord, a number of them joined in with us on those missions that we started. And I'm thankful for the precious and very rich input that they put in coming along as team members in those travelling times of ministry.